Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. I'm Mark Gibson, and I'm head of the Teagasc Outreach and Innovation Department, and we're coming to you from a somewhat overcast Oak Park, County Carlow this morning. I'm also joined by Pat Murphy, who is head of the Teagasc Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme. Good morning to you, Pat.
Good morning.
And just a reminder to everybody that this series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network, and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. And today we'll be discussing the implications of climate neutrality for agriculture, land use and forestry in Ireland. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. David Stiles, lecturer in environmental engineering at University Limerick. Good morning, David. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm yourself. Good morning, Mark. I'm good. Thank you very much.
Great, great. And David, you're coming to us from Galway this morning, is that right?
That's right, from Moycullen, the rainy Moycullen in Galway. That's where I'm based.
Very good, very good. So you're based in the University of Limerick. Could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there in University of Limerick?
I suppose a lot of our work really focuses on life cycle assessment and how to kind of account for the greenhouse gas emissions and other impacts arising from bioeconomy kind of production systems, farming systems. And recently, which I'll show in the presentation, we've had a sequester project looking at how we can balance out emissions with removals at a landscape level in Ireland.
So this is a really hot topic at the moment in agriculture. Obviously, there's the carbon budgeting processes on the horizon for the whole of Ireland. So there'll be a lot of people watching with great interest today about the prospect of or the role of sequestration in that carbon balancing exercise that will have to happen over the next number of years. But today, what sort of a range are you looking at for this type of work?
We're really looking at 2050 as a time horizon. So I know there's a lot of talk at the moment about the budget for 2030. And so we're looking further ahead, the specific target the country has for climate neutrality. And so when we look ahead that far, we're talking about pretty serious areas, as I'll show you, kind of 500,000 to 1 million hectares might be needed to diversify into options to have carbon removal. So it's a pretty large scale we need to think about for 2050, really. But we need to obviously start that process sooner rather than later to get there by 2050. And that's the kind of message, if you like, that's underlying the presentation.
Okay, so some fairly transformative change required over the next number of decades. Okay, well, look, David, if you could share your screen with us, and we'll get going with the presentation. We'll hand over to you, David, and we'll chat to you afterwards.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks very much for the invitation to present here today on the Signpost series. It's a great opportunity to reach the wide audience and talk about some of these thorny issues. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk about the implications of climate neutrality for Ireland's land sector. And I'll kind of acknowledge people that have been working closely on various projects on this over the past few years, including Colin Duffy, Remy Prudhomme, Ailey Forster, Mary Ryan and Colin O'Donoghue. And they've all been contributing in one way or another to our sequester project, which is the EPA DEFRAN project, which has been looking at how we get to climate neutrality in the AFLU sector by 2050. So to give you an outline, the objective really here is to deliver some insight from recent research on the land sector. We don't have by any means all the solutions, but I just want to give a feel for the magnitude of some of the changes that, according to the evidence that we have at the moment, look like will be needed to get to climate neutrality by 2050. So I'd like to start off with actually offering the conclusions, just to give you a kind of initial feel for the scale of this challenge that we need to address. And then I'll step back and we'll look at the context. We'll look at what we can do with livestock abatement and some of the limitations of that, and then the need for land use diversification with a few discussion slides at the end. So firstly, I'll start by saying that when we talk about 2050 and climate neutrality, it's a very long way from where we are now. So in a way, what we need to do is kind of dream about what the future could look like, because it certainly doesn't look like what we have at the moment, with probably in the region of 25 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent from the land use sector. And that's after accounting for the existing sequestration we have from forests and wood products, and from mineral soil, grasslands on mineral soils. So we have a huge challenge. We essentially need to get that 25 million tonnes down to zero by 2050 in net, and that's the challenge we're facing. And that's why we take this perspective of trying to reimagine what the future could look like. And then the question is, how do we get there? So we don't have all the answers, but we have some indications of the magnitude of land use change we might need to get to that kind of balance by 2050. And that's what I'd like to talk through today. So the conclusions then, to start off that way, is that the climate emergency is going to drive transformative change, whether we like it or not, and that's going to happen over the next 3 decades. Climate neutrality really shifts the focus. So now with the Paris Agreement, we talk about climate neutral 2050, or the second half of the century. That really shifts the focus from these kind of incremental improvements in efficiency towards absolute national targets. So each country is supposed to reach climate neutrality at territorial level. And that's a different ball game from just improving efficiency. It really is a zero-sum game, and it requires that all emissions of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide will be balanced by removals. We'll talk about methane later. We estimate from the work that we're probably going to need in the region of 1 million hectares of diversification away from traditional agricultural production in order to deliver the types of land use change required to be compatible with climate neutrality and to offer enough offsets to maintain productive agriculture on the remainder of the land. So this obviously implies some degree of herd reduction, and the level of herd reduction is going to be really highly dependent on the efficiency of future-looking abatement technologies, not what we know work at the moment, but what we hope could work in the future. So failure to plan beyond important medium-term targets, such as, for example, the carbon budget we're talking about now for 2030, failure to plan beyond that is actually a big risk. There's a risk of misallocation of resources. There's a risk of disorderly contraction of bovine production. There's a risk of stranded assets because we might be investing in infrastructure now for production and also for abatement of that production, which might become redundant if we don't have the measures in place to support that production through offsets in the future. And we might not be prepared to actually exploit some of the emerging markets and opportunities that are going to arise with this rapidly developing market in carbon and carbon pricing and bioproducts and bioenergy that's going to go with that as we try to decarbonize the whole economy. So there are lots of opportunities here we need to grasp, but to do that, we need to plan. And there's an urgent need there for this, some kind of vision, a vision or multiple visions. Not everybody's going to agree on the same vision, but at the moment, we don't seem to have many clear visions of what the future could look like. And that's really, I think, what we're calling for at the end of the Sequester project, is for the land use sector and stakeholders to engage to create some of these visions, because that's the way of maximizing the chances of a just transition for farmers, and to make sure that we can reward farmers for all the public goods they deliver, as well as the food which is valued at the moment in the market. So to provide some context, it's really important to start off with acknowledging the success of Ireland's agri-food sector, and it produces a huge amount of milk and beef for export with a comparatively low carbon footprint compared with international production. The marginal abatement costs curve that's been developed by Teagasc has identified a further 15% of emission cuts that can be made to current production. So we've got the opportunity to become more efficient in bovine production. Ireland relies on an extremely productive grass platform with grass growth in some areas for most days of the year. And that's an excellent basis for protein production via ruminants, which doesn't rely on cropland, and it keeps large stores of carbon in the soil beneath that land. So that's potentially, it does have a very important contribution to make to sustainable food production well into the future. There's a very efficient value chain because spring calving is linked with the export of milk solids, which are sensitive to seasonality of production. It means that Ireland can produce milk solids at very low cost compared with other competitors in Europe. And the sector agriculture contributes 7% to gross national income and employment, and 10% to export value. So it's a really important sector for Ireland's kind of economic well-being. Plus, there are large multiplier effects of 1.8 to 2.5 times the actual economic activity in the agriculture sector itself. There have been some initiatives to really put in place excellent traceability, especially for the beef, so that people know where that meat is coming from. The quality standards and the welfare standards are excellent by international comparisons. And the landscape in Ireland contains massive carbon stores, though not necessarily large ongoing sinks of carbon, which is what we'll come to during this presentation. On the other hand, we know we live in an era where climate is changing rapidly. We see those effects, and farmers see those effects more than anybody. And we have a climate and biodiversity emergency. And it's clear that Ireland is a bit of an outlier within the EU. We have emissions of over 12 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita, 35% of which is from agriculture. And those emissions have been going in the wrong direction relative to our targets. We have a land use sector, excluding agriculture, which is a net greenhouse gas emitter, which is quite unusual, and that's because of the large area of drained organic peaty soils. We're exceeding targets for ammonia, for nitrogen oxides. We're starting to experience declining water quality, and meanwhile, we're importing huge value of fossil fuels every year, and that looks like it's only going to increase in terms of the cost of some of those fossil fuels. So we have some big challenges globally, and Ireland actually as a microcosm is experiencing many of those challenges directly as a country. So this is going to drive change. We know as we see more of these impacts, there's going to be more political pressure to take more action, and we can see already with the carbon budget, we've got some ambitious targets now for very large reductions by 2030, and that pressure is going to be maintained and probably increased as we see more and more evidence of climate change. Globally, the modelling that's been done suggests that we are going to see very large-scale shifts in land use if we are to have any chance of meeting climate stabilisation. So I won't dwell on these graphs, but they're basically some possible scenarios which have been modelled at the global level for how we achieve climate stabilisation. And on the left side, we've got a graph where we try to cut emissions very quickly, and therefore we don't need as many offsets into the future. On the right-hand side, we've got a graph where we leave the reduction of emissions till very late, towards 2050, and then we have what we call a lot of overshoot, emissions overshoot, which we need to compensate then with even higher levels of offset in the land sector, and ultimately we'd be relying in that scenario on what we call bioenergy carbon capture and storage to take that biogenic carbon produced on land in bioenergy crops and trees and to lock it away in the old oil and gas wells that we've been using to provide our fossil fuels. So we're essentially pumping that carbon back down into the original wells where we got the oil from in the first place. It's like a reverse logistics of the fossil fuel industry. And that's what we're looking at with overshoots. And land sector will be very important to provide that initial carbon storage or carbon capture, in tree growth and biomass growth to support that. So depending on how fast we are at cutting emissions, will have implications for how ambitious or how big the scale of change will be in the land use sector to compensate for those emissions. That's one key message from this, and we'll look at this in an Irish context in a few minutes. So in terms of where we stand at the moment in Ireland from the latest inventory figures, we have just over 20 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent coming from agriculture. About 60% of that is from methane. It's not all, mostly cattle, not all cattle. Manure, soil nitrogen inputs from excretion, from manures and from fertilizers. If we take a life cycle perspective, we also actually import fertilizers which need to be manufactured, and we also import some feed, and the emissions from that feed production are quite uncertain, and they depend on whether you count land use change to convert to cropland to make some of those feed crops in there. But we've also got a huge chunk of emissions, over 10 to 11 million tonnes in total, from both drained organic soils and exploited wetlands, and that makes a massive contribution to Ireland's inventory, which hasn't had to be reported until very recently, and from now on it will be reported, and that will be counted in future targets. And of course, if we want to achieve climate neutrality, all those emissions will need to be reduced or offset, and so that makes a massive that makes that challenge, if you like, of climate neutral agriculture even greater, because the land sector is going to have to reduce and offset all these drained organic soil emissions. At the moment, we've got a grassland sink of about 2 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent into mineral soils, and that's largely a function of grassland improvement. And the way that works in the inventory, that improvement, once that improvement stops, then that sink will fall out of the inventory, so we can't rely on that for 2050. Meanwhile, we've got a sink of about 4.5 million tonnes from forestry at the moment, and you could add about 1.5 million tons from wood products onto that, carbon storage and wood products, but that's a declining sink because of the harvest dynamics. We haven't been planting much forest recently, and there have been some recently published new organic soil emission factors for organic soils under forest. So where we planted forest in the past on organic soils, the emissions are actually much higher than we thought. And that's going to mean that actually forestry is not going to contribute much of a sink at all towards 2030. And it just makes the challenge even greater for where we find the offsets for these emissions.
David, could I ask you just if you could go look at that grassland carbon? Could you explain that just a little bit more clearly for us there, the temporary nature of that?
Sure. So as I understand it at the moment, that's a function of when you improve grasslands and you put more nitrogen inputs into that grassland, it gets more productive, and that higher productivity supports more biomass ultimately going back into the soil. You've got more grass growth, a lot of it's taken up by animals, of course, but then it's returned in manures, some of it's returned in residues, and the soil over time accumulates more carbon that way. So productive grassland has a higher carbon storage than kind of rough grazing or unimproved grassland. And so as I understand it, over the recent kind of decades, more grassland has been converted into productive grassland, and that's resulted in this transition towards a higher level of carbon stock. And the way it works in the inventory, there's a 20-year transition period. So after a land use change from unimproved to improved grasslands, the carbon increase between those two grassland types is divided by 20 years, and it manifests over 20 years in the inventory. So that's been happening. That's kind of a reflection of land use change that's been happening over the past few decades. Unless we continue indefinitely to improve grassland, and we're going to run out of grassland to improve, then that effect is going to drop out of the inventory. So it's really, when it drops out, is a question of how much more improvement goes on. And there's obviously a 20-year lag after that improvement stops until it completely drops out. But it's a temporary effect. It's not a permanent effect, in other words. And it's kind of got a 20-year lifetime, if you like, as a sink.
Mm-hmm. And we have to balance that with the semi-natural grasslands that support biodiversity then as well. So I guess you're into a swapping scenario. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a kind of trade-off there, if you like, between the biodiversity and the increasing the carbon sink. And of course, these are based on our current understanding, and it's a very broad brush tier 1 approach at the moment for these things in the national inventory. And we do hope the inventory will improve, and that might change the picture. But this is kind of based on the current methodologies which have been proven up to now, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the kind of story up to now. We've got this large emission essentially from the sector that needs to be offset. The question then is, how do you define climate neutrality? And when we started the project, we thought this would be the easy bit, because everybody was using the GWP 100 approach, and we had the inventory to go with, and we thought, well, it's just getting down to zero in the inventory. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that, because the scientific understanding has evolved, and we know that methane is being treated now differently from carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So we've got a question about aggregation metrics, about the time frame, about whether we look at cumulative emissions up until 2050, or do we look at a balance in 2050 and beyond? And those are kind of details which are being talked through at the moment in various forums. But if we talk about methane first, because it's been discussed a lot, and we have this challenge of metrics, different metrics. In the national inventory, we use a GWP 100 approach, which gives you the average warming of each kilogram of methane emitted over 100 years. But there's been a lot of talk about this new metric, GWP star, which is much more aligned with the global scenarios of warming effects of changes in methane emissions through time. So this is all about the marginal change in warming from changing levels of emissions in relation to a reference level. It's a very forward-looking metric. GWP 100 is very useful for attribution. It's very scalable, convenient for inventories and footprints. GWP star is not useful for attribution. It's very difficult when you start trying to downscale this from a global level, because you start off with a certain reference point and you need to understand what those emissions relate to. That's not easy to do with GWP star, so it's not a convenient metric for inventories. However, GWP 100 gives very poor representation of net warming effect towards climate neutrality as we get closer to climate neutrality, especially for countries with high methane contributions the GWP 100 doesn't reflect the fact that we don't need to get to zero to have a zero net warming effect for methane. Whereas obviously with the GWP star, the strength is that we do much better represent the net warming effect through time as we move towards climate neutrality. So it's a very useful forward-looking metric. So there's been a lot of debate about this, and in my view, it started to perhaps get a bit distracting from the key point, which is that we know at global level that we need to actually reduce methane by 24 to 47% as the estimates to achieve climate stabilization. So that's the global reduction in biogenic methane that is required by 2050. The question then is really what's Ireland's fair share of that emission pie that will be left of methane within a sustainable climate neutral system globally? And there are different ways you can calculate this. We did some work on the sequester project looking at how we slice up that pie according to economics, according to population, according to protein production. And depending on the method you take, you'd end up with a very different result. But basically it indicated that somewhere between 30 to 79% reduction would be required by 2050 relative to 2010 for Ireland to comply with some kind of objective definition of a fair share internationally. So what we're going to do now is park methane. We need to have big reductions in methane. We don't know exactly how big. I think that will be subject to international negotiations, but they're going to be big, and that needs to be tackled separately as a gas. So that really leaves for the balance carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide to balance out. And a lot of those emissions that we saw from the organic soils are carbon dioxide. About 40% of emissions from agriculture are the nitrous oxide and CO2. So we've got the agricultural emissions, we've got the organic soil emissions that need to come down, and whatever we get them down to, excuse me, needs to be balanced with offsets. And as I explained, we can't at the moment, on current understanding, rely on soils being a long-term offset, mineral soils. So really, we don't have many options. Trees are the only really proven, scalable carbon removal technology we have. So essentially, it comes down to a balance between agricultural production emissions, organic soil emissions, and forestry to offset those emissions. Those are the really three levers we have to pull. So we can go for reducing emissions in agriculture through efficiency or reduced activity. We can go for reducing organic soil emissions by re-wetting, and we can go for offsetting those emissions through forestry. So it actually comes down to quite a simple story, but that simple story perhaps belies the ambition that needs to go into that to make it work, because it is a zero-sum game. And it's quite simple, really, because less ambition in one sector, less ambition in driving down emissions in agriculture, simply means you have to have more ambition in the offsetting. That's the nature of the zero-sum game. And these are the land areas we're talking about to achieve the offsets necessary to support these kind of levels of reduction. So at the one end, we've got only going for, say, 25% emission reduction in agriculture, 25% re-wetting. Then we need to afforest 0.8 to 1 million hectares of land between now and 2050 to generate enough offset to offset those emissions. On the other hand, if we can, over the next 30 years, with various technologies and management practices, drive down emissions of agriculture by 75%, and if we can re-wet, similarly, 75% of drained organic soils, then we need a much smaller area of 0.3 to 0.4 million hectares of forestry to offset those emissions. So that's the kind of nature of the zero-sum game of climate neutrality. It's about achieving an absolute balance, and we don't have many levers to pull to do that. So the less ambitious we are on one lever, the more ambitious we have to be on another lever. That's the simple message, really, that comes out from those numbers. So I won't go into detail here, but just in the sequester project, where we've been looking at this for the past few years, we've developed a biophysical model, which is largely based on the National Inventory Report for the land sector. So we look at all the emissions from within the land sector, taking a tier 2 approach for animal emissions related to productivity, to grassland soil sequestration, to forestry sequestration and emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that then we can use this biophysical model as a platform to then look at lots of other bio-based value chains in the future. And we're just starting to do that now. But one of the attractions of putting all this into a model, and I should acknowledge here that Remy Prudhomme and Colin Duffy have been at the coalface here, really doing a lot of the hard work with the coding that brought together previous models that we've used in the past in a basic Excel format. They put it all into Python code. And the attraction of doing that is that we can now randomize the running of scenarios. So we don't have to have preconceptions about what we think is going to be climate neutral. We simply run the model with randomized inputs for the land sector, and we see what the model spits out. And then the ones that we can then filter them and see which ones actually comply with different definitions of climate neutrality. So we've just got this to work fully. Column's just got it to generate 850 randomized scenarios. And I can't show them today. It's brand new data that we're just sifting through at the moment, but it's an attractive way of taking the prior assumptions out of any kind of vision, if you like, of what climate neutrality could look like. It's trying to be objective about what the combination of animal productivity, animal emission intensity, and animal numbers and different land uses could be to achieve that climate neutrality. So obviously one way we can get towards climate neutrality is to try and drive down emissions from agriculture. And that's going to be something that's very important. And I mean, Teagasc have done and are doing a huge amount of excellent work in this regard. So the MAC work that Gary Lanigan and Trevor Donlan led publication of in 2018 shows that we can achieve about 15% decoupling of emissions from production by 2030. So that's important, and it's really important that those measures are implemented, but that still leaves us quite a long way from where we need to be in terms of climate neutrality. So there's a lot of work that's now going on into ways of trying to reduce methane, such as 3-NOP, and maybe that could work with things like boluses for grazing animals. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to ascertain the feasibility and the costs of these things, but potentially we could be talking about quite significant reductions in methane from something like that. There's also work going on, for example, at Solar Head Farm, looking at zero synthetic nitrogen fertilizer inputs using grass clover to biologically fix nitrogen to avoid those nitrous oxide emissions arising from fertilizer application. There's also things like inhibited urea, which can be used to massively reduce the emission factor of nitrous oxide. So there are some options out there through management and through technology, which could quite dramatically reduce methane and nitrous oxide, but they have yet to be proven. And I guess they're things that we hope we can rely on, but we're very uncertain about how much they can be relied on, because to give us that balance of emissions and removals into the future. So this story of climate neutrality is not clear at all. It's going to evolve dramatically in the future, depending on the success of these innovations, I think. Another point is that if we start talking about having to prioritize parts of the herd because it might be necessary to reduce some of the herd, because we see that the scale of reductions we need to be able to offset are going to be quite large, and the areas of land we need for the offsets are going to be quite large. So that inherently implies there's going to be a necessity to think about reducing herd numbers in aggregate. Then it comes down to the question of what's the balance between dairy and suckler herds, and obviously, just from a purely economic perspective and carbon perspective, it might look like an easy win to remove kind of non-milking or suckler herd or some of the suckler herd from the system and focus on the more profitable dairy production. So a few important caveats here, of course, aside from all the important kind of cultural and economic implications of that just specializing in dairy production, like some very specialized systems in the US, for example, and other countries, might look very efficient from a milk production perspective because they carry very low overheads in terms of following animals, and they feed their animals very highly digestible feed with low emissions. That can look quite good if you take a narrow life cycle assessment perspective, just looking at the farm boundary and the feed production. But once you start thinking about the co-production of beef, which is a really important output from a dairy system, and the surplus calves which go on to be fattened to produce beef, systems that look very efficient because they're very specialized often don't look so efficient when you expand the boundaries. So we've done a little bit of work on this in Costa Rica and in the UK. Some of the implications of intensification and specialization are that you can drive down your milk footprint, but you end up increasing the global footprint, if you like, of milk and beef production, because you've simply got to, unless we dramatically reduce our beef consumption, then we're going to need to produce that beef in a suckler herd, which always has higher emissions than dairy beef. So Perhaps there's an opportunity to focus on maximising dairy beef output alongside milk production in Ireland, because that's a way of contributing best towards a sustainable milk and beef production system. Obviously, these issues are very thorny, and they've got implications for land use patterns, biodiversity, water quality, etc. So that leads us on to the kind of necessity, if you like, to have some kind of diversification of land use, because we obviously need to have offsets in place to offset emissions, residual emissions in 2050. And this isn't actually just for the land sector and for agriculture. We're going to need extra emissions from other sectors and for the wider economy. I won't focus on those for now, but those demands are going to be there. And I mean, that could also create opportunities in terms of carbon credits, etc., that could be paid for by companies that need to offset residual emissions. But basically, if we take a scenario, if you see the red dotted line here, where we've got a 50% reduction in agricultural emissions, if we can re-wet about 75% of drained organic soils, we then need to think about the level of offsets needed to balance out those residual emissions. And if we do that, and we look at typical rates of commercial kind of species mix forestry, 70% conifer, or more conservation mix with only 30% conifer, then we're talking about between 18,000 and 22,000 hectares every year being planted between, say, 2025 and 2050 in order to get the correct level or the necessary level of offsets, just to balance out those emissions. So you can see that relative to what we're talking about in our climatise at the moment of 8,000 hectares per year, we're talking about massively higher planting rates being needed in order to generate those offsets in the future, to give kind of allowance, if you want to put it that way, for future emissions. And the implication is that either we achieve those emissions by or those offsets by starting now with ambitious afforestation, or we end up in the position where we don't have them in place, and we either pay massive fines, billions of euros at the national level, because we're talking about carbon being priced at hundreds of euros per tonne of CO2 by 2050, or we have to, in a disorderly fashion, very quickly contract production. So those are the possible implications, if you like, of not ensuring we're on a pathway to achieving the offsets that we need by 2050. So we can see that it's going to really take quite a large area of land by 2050 in order to deliver that organic soil re-wetting. We're talking about, say, at least 250,000 hectares of organic soils being re-wetted, and in the region of 0.6 million hectares, 0.5 or 0.6 million hectares, yeah, of forests being planted by then. So it's got big implications for land use. An important point, of course, is that forestry doesn't deliver offsets straight away. It takes time to accumulate. I've got some caveats here about the model that we're using, which is a bit different from the CBM model used in the National Inventory. Baseline is going to be a bit different because we've got an assumption about forests being harvested at the economic optimum, which is not what's happening at the moment. So that the so-called carbon cliff is a bit later here than it is in other work that's been done. But essentially what you can see is that once you start going to higher levels of afforestation, it takes some time for them to really kick in and really start generating those offsets into the future that we need. And by 2030, which is the current budget period, even if we start planting very quickly and very ambitiously, we're not actually going to achieve much additional offset by 2030. So forestry is not really well recognized, if you like, in the short term, because of its long-term afforestation takes a long time to really start generating those credits. Forestry management can play an important role for existing forestry in meeting the 2030 target, but we need to be conscious of the 2050 target because of the time lag. And so if we only focus on 2030 now and don't think about 2050, we risk being in the same place again and panicking in 10 years or 20 years time because we just don't have the offsets that we really need. So that's why it's important to start planning now for the offsets. Of course, climate neutrality isn't just about 2050. We need to look beyond that, and the dynamics of forestry are complex. So these are very simplified scenarios from some old modeling work. So they're really just to indicate that the general pattern. If we have a more conservation type forest, we can have some very strong offset going into, say, 2070. That level of offset starts to reduce then towards 2120, 100 years from now. If we go to commercial forest and we harvest them, then we can end up actually having a delayed carbon cliff, quite a large carbon cliff around 2080. And of course, that will be balanced again through time with additional future offsets, but it means that the average strength of that sink is going to be weaker through time. But this is only the terrestrial balance, and this is where I think we need some different intersectoral thinking, because the trees go somewhere, the wood goes somewhere. And in recent work we published in Nature Communications, we've shown that the contribution of forestry to terrestrial carbon is very important. But over a 100-year time frame, the contribution of forestry to downstream mitigation by substitution of fossil fuels and concrete, even assuming decarbonisation of those sectors in the future, and the contribution to harvested wood product carbon storage, that more than doubles the net sequestration, or the net offset, if you like, the net mitigation that we can achieve by forestry long term. So we need to think about those downstream effects of forestry and how we can integrate them into the Irish economy to reduce the 3 million tonnes of CO2 that we have coming from the cement sector, and the millions of tonnes of CO2 we have coming from different parts of the energy sector. So there's an opportunity here to link land use with downstream mitigation, and that's the kind of thinking we're going to need if we have any chance of getting to climate neutrality. So just to think about this in timescale, we've got terrestrial carbon storage over the first decades. We've got substitution then with the thinnings and the first harvests of concrete, of energy. We've got harvested wood product carbon storage, which could happen for many decades after the harvest. And then we've got the opportunity to use that wood after it's been in buildings, for example. So that's how we can end up with very long mitigation from forestry. There's obviously an opportunity to diversify into renewable energy. Biogas is touted as something that's very compatible with a grass-based system with all the slurry and manure that's generated. That's an excellent feedstock for anaerobic digestion, as is food waste and residues. We need to be careful about putting in edible byproducts or grass and maize, because they take a lot of land. And when we start looking at the conversion efficiency of area to energy, we end up with a very poor outcome for things like maize and grass. So just to give an example, if we have a maize biogas combined heat and power plant, we might achieve 32 megawatt hours per hectare per year of net energy. If we put solar panels, we're talking about over 1,000 megawatt hours per year of energy. And this is in the Welsh context, so it's not the sunniest part of the world. If we're talking about wind, we end up with over 3,000 megawatt hours per net hectare used. So simply using land for biogas via grass it's a very inefficient use of land. But nonetheless, if it helps to, in limited quantities, to leverage the ability to digest slurry and reduce those emissions and generate some renewable energy that way, then that can be a good thing, and it can facilitate a bio-based transition. But we need to be careful about the scale and the scope of this. And of course, there's all sorts of disruptive technologies that are on the horizon that we don't know about.
2 minutes left, David.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So we don't know about these things. They're going to come on the horizon, and they could be a joker in the pack that completely change where we're going. So that's an indication of the balance. There's lots of challenges. Dairy farmers are currently riding a market wave. Beef farmers are just getting by. It's not very profitable. They're not getting well compensated for their work. But there have been negative experience with diversification in the past, which are going to put farmers off any future trajectories without long-term, stable kind of indications of support. We need to develop a framework to support supply and demand. So bioindustrial policy needs to be developed alongside producing the feedstocks. There's a lot of bureaucracy around forestry, which is hindering its implementation at the moment. Of course, we're going to need good monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon credits in the future. And there's questions around who owns those carbon credits. The key question is, can policy support and bridge the temporal disconnect between the costs and benefits that we're seeing and the anticipated future costs of emissions and the future value of carbon credits with the low current value of carbon credits being offered? And what are the control points, and what scale do we achieve neutrality at? So in summary, change is happening. A reactive approach carries many risks in terms of economic, reputational, quality of life risks. A proactive approach can consolidate and develop Ireland's advantages, and we need to integrate a vision for the land sector with other sectors of the economy, but also think about how we integrate efficiency with abatement, with diversification, and with resilience and adaptation. We need to do all those things. We can't just concentrate on one or the other. And farmers, of course, are the agents of change who work extremely hard to manage the landscape, but they need support and guidance to give indication of where we need to go. And there is an opportunity here to reevaluate what farmers do, but perhaps more importantly, how they're rewarded for what they do, all the services that are provided now that they're not paid for, which are very valuable. So we know the key ingredients to neutrality will be ambitious livestock abatement, herd reduction, to some extent, hundreds of thousands of hectares of organic soil rewetting, wetland regeneration, hundreds of thousands of hectares of afforestation, mix of commercial and conservation, diversification of the bioeconomy. We simply have to do all of those things, I think, by the look of it, to actually have any chance of getting to climate neutrality. Now, the exact mix depends on what is deemed to be most attractive and acceptable, and I think stakeholders need to engage with that to determine the exact recipe. As I said, it's a zero-sum game, so the more you do in one area, the less you might need to do in another. But those levers need to be pulled quite hard to get to climate neutrality. So I'm sorry I went over a bit over time. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. No, you did well time-wise, considering the complexity of the subject, and thank you for stepping us through that. I mean, it is, there's no doubt about it, it is a very complicated area when you start looking at offsets and life cycle analysis and so forth. I mean, you did mention the difference between suckler beef production and dairy beef production, and the differences there in terms of the emissions associated with them. I suppose what I'm keen to do as well here today is to talk about the broader context of that in Ireland, and obviously there's a strong tradition there of suckler beef production, and its suitability for particular parts of the country as well. So I think it's just worth mentioning that all of what you've spoken about there's obviously there's wider implications for those decisions to be made. You mentioned at the start, I think you said the phrase, we need to dream about the future. And I know that probably 20 years ago, we probably wouldn't have imagined ourselves here talking on a webinar system from our homes following or during a pandemic. I'd just be interested on your own thoughts of what that future you see from your own point of view. What are you allowed as a scientist to dream about the future?
Well, I think there are a couple of points here. I think it's a kind of mug's game to predict the future, basically. And I think it's a difficult area to be in, but we know we're a long way from where we need to be. And I think one of the key messages for me is that we can't predict, actually, some wonderful technology could come along to completely decouple emissions from agricultural production. And that would be fantastic. And maybe in the next 30 years, that will come along and we'll meet our 2050 targets anyway. And that's great. We can't predict that. But what we know is that with things in the pipeline at the moment, what's very clear to me is that we can mitigate emissions sooner or later. But if we're serious about 2050, it's inevitable we're going to need a large level of offset. That's just one inescapable fact of climate neutrality that I can see. And that offset's going to come probably for the agricultural sector to offset residual emissions, but definitely also from the rest of the sector. We've got 40 million tons of CO2 coming from the rest of Ireland's economy. If we can reduce that by 90%, we've still got 4 million tons of CO2 that need to be offset. So there are going to be very big demands on offsetting in the future. That's just inescapable. That's the reality of climate neutrality. And I think Ireland's land sector is the sector that can deliver that. No other sector is able to deliver that. So one way or another, we can't predict the future, but we know we're going to need a lot of offset. That's something I'm very confident about as a scientist.
You also mentioned the topic of just transition, and look, I'm conscious a lot of questions coming through, and we have a huge level of interest in this topic. But I am keen to tease out the whole concept or principle of just transition, because it has been talked about a lot, but it seems to be quite a risky principle in that you're asking people to trust that okay, we're going to change practices here, and essentially you're not going to be disadvantaged as a result of this. How confident are you that we as a society are able to make that just transition? Big question, I know, but it's just
it's an important question. I mean, sometimes I'm very pessimistic these days, but I mean we know change is coming, and we can see climate change happening. We can see it getting worse, and we can see that eventually the way we are as humans, we react when there's a problem, and as the problem manifests more, then the reaction becomes stronger and there's more pressure to do something. So somewhere between now and 2050, we know that there's going to be a lot more agitation. Like there's already quite strong agitation, there'll be more to take action. And that could happen quite quickly. And that's going to cause big risks and disruption because, I mean, beef is a high emission product. There'll be questions over beef. There's a lot of disruptive technology in the pipeline around alternative proteins, for example. I think that there's very high risk of keeping going as we are, because I think things are going to change. And I think there's no risk-free option. We're in a time of change, and it's not easy for anybody. None of us like change, but actually change is happening, whether we like it or not. And there are lots of risks of a just transition. I think it would be hard to pull off well, but I think there are probably even bigger risks of not trying to make that transition and not trying to plan ahead for the future. So I think there's no easy option. We're just in a position where we, as a society, we consume a huge amount, we emit a huge amount. It's fundamentally unsustainable, and we have to change. But how we do that is going to be an evolving, iterative process. And there's no, I think the more we can try and project into the future of some of the things we know we need to do, like the offsets and decarbonisation of energy, for example, we know we have to do all those things. The more we get on with those things, the better we have a chance of a just transition. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to involve different business models and paying people for doing things we don't pay for at the moment. Like we don't pay farmers for managing the landscape or delivering a nice countryside that we all like to look at or walk in, or maintaining carbon stores. And those are things that are going to need to be paid for in the future, I think.
Okay, David, thank you for that. I'm conscious we've a lot of interest, a lot of questions coming through here. So, yeah. So if we could try and cluster some of the questions, Pat, and okay. David, if you could be maybe concise in your responses as well, we might be able to get through some more of them. So over to you, Pat.
Yeah, and I think there's a comment from a farmer here, and it says, as a farmer, are we happy to farm carbon and our food? Once carbon is valued correctly and consumers are willing to pay for it, I would be happy to farm carbon. But who is my consumer, and who is going to pay? And maybe it's not so much a question as a comment. A question then. Considering the different metrics for CH4 can cause confusion, should we aim to split the greenhouse gas approach and have specific metrics for each of the greenhouse gases instead of aggregating them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It seems that it works pretty well for nitrous oxide and CO2 because they're both long-lived gases. So I think looking for a balance in those gases makes a lot of sense. Methane, because of its short-lived nature, that's why it's treated differently, and we have different metrics. But I think it makes a lot of sense to package that out and look at a separate target for methane. But I think we can still aggregate nitrous oxide and CO2 because we need to do that to get to a balance.
Okay. A comment: urgency required all round. And the question: what are the plans to re-wet organic soils, and what about support for polluticulture to allow income on re-wetted soils? And I suppose the issue on potential income of re-wetting soils is a really big issue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't have all the answers to these things. I think they are things that have to be done, and I think farmers are the people that will need to be on the ground doing them, but they will need to be somehow rewarded, and it's going to be worth a lot to the country in terms of avoided fines for re-wetting those soils because of the large emissions that they're generating at the moment. So somehow it's about transferring that national benefit to the farmer. That comes back to that question of who pays, I think, for carbon farming. It's that national benefit into the future needs to be somehow monetized and translated to farmers now, so that farmers can take action now.
Okay, there's a good few questions around the whole potential role of regenerative agriculture, rewilding, organic agriculture. Maybe lumping a lot of people's questions into one, the potential role of those relative to conventional, what you might call more conventional agriculture and forestry, and where does the whole mix come together?
I think that's a part of the discussion for that vision for the future. Like if some of those business models, if they can be translated into business models that work for farmers, some of those alternative options, then I think they need to be part of that diversification, because anything that we can do to kind of reduce dependence on very high emission types of agriculture is going to help with the climate neutrality ambition, I think.
A very specific question in relation to the Goblin model. Are you using GWP star or GWP 100 in dealing with methane?
It's neutral because we generate gases and we're filtering in different ways. So that's what we're doing at the moment, filtering with GWP 100 and filtering without methane in there. So we're doing it in different ways.
Just a question, is the land sector expected to carry more than its fair share in climate neutrality? Is transport, domestic and international, and industry doing their piece?
Everybody's going to have to take really dramatic action when you look at the challenge of what we need to achieve. I think the reality is there are going to be residual emissions, like calcination process in cement, aviation. There are some reasons we can't get some emissions down to zero without completely stopping some activities in agriculture, of course, as well. So that's why we're going to need some offsets. And land is the only sector able to deliver those offsets. So everybody needs to do something, but there will be offsets required also for the non-land use sector, and the land sector will have to deliver those offsets. But I think this is where the idea of income comes in, because those sectors are going to have to pay for those offsets. So that's where future markets will develop, and that's where there's an opportunity.
And a number of questions coming in and probably typified by this question: where does food security fit into the mix in terms of climate change debate and agriculture with world population increasing?
Mm-hmm. Well, food security is obviously a primary objective. At the moment, we're not short of food by any means, and it's partly about distribution, it's about diet as well as it is about the total amount we produce. But there's huge opportunity to produce more food than we do actually on a smaller area of land. And Ireland is very efficient, and we should recognize that. But there are areas of Brazil, millions and millions of hectares, which are used very inefficiently. And those are the areas that are going to need to become more efficient to deliver that food. And Ireland can only do so much. And I think we need to achieve our kind of territorial balance as part of our international commitments.
Okay, there's a number of questions as well in relation to the grassland sequestration and the calculation of the current calculation, I think, as I understand it, of change in land in land use, giving you a 20-year window for a sequestration. Is the potential there for research to prove or disprove grassland sequestration on an ongoing basis, and is there something to be gained in that space?
Yeah, I mean, there is. That's a very uncertain area, and there's a lot of talk and different research has been done on this. It's just so hard to prove because long-term, obviously it takes very long-term measurements. These changes are very gradual over time. But I mean, if we're lucky, we might be talking something like half a ton of CO2 per hectare per year or a ton of CO2 per hectare per year. That could make a useful contribution if it could be demonstrated. And it's not going to be a panacea, but it could contribute something. But we just don't have enough evidence yet, and that there is a need for more information there, I think.
Just a question here, and David seemed to suggest that carbon emissions are higher for beef than dairy cows. I understand, and he's just saying that that's contrary to what he's saying. I think it's contrary to what you're saying as well.
Yeah, it's the emission intensity of the beef produced. The dairy beef has a much lower emission intensity than beef, and then because there are more beef cows in total, or non-milking cows really, actually, including followers, they contribute more in aggregate than the milking cows.
What role do you think bioenergy, biogas has in supporting diversification and decarbonising of the agricultural economy?
Yeah, I think it can provide a very important pathway. As I mentioned, it's not actually a very efficient energy conversion technology, so it's really good for managing waste. So if we can get slurries into anaerobic digesters, that would be fantastic, but there's lots of logistical issues around that. And there's work in other countries around hub and pod concepts where you can produce a bit of biogas and somehow bottle it or store it and transport it to a central location where you use it for energy conversion. I think we need to look at things like that, because with lots of well-distributed farms, smaller farms through the countryside, it's difficult to implement these things, but they could be part of the solution with some good logistical planning.
David, you mentioned about the estimate of 1 million hectares of diversification required. has that been broken down, or are there?
I mean, that's just a very rough number, kind of looking at the magnitude of forestry planting that we'll need to get the level of offsets associated with, say, a 50% agricultural emission reduction, and the level of the area of rewetting of organic soils. So those two things together come close to 1 million hectares if we achieve a 50% reduction in agricultural emissions. So it's a very ballpark figure of the kind of area that might be needed, just to show the scale, really.
Okay, and I didn't see reference to additions to or supplementation in diets within your presentation. No, maybe I just skipped it, but
that's true. I mean, I suppose that's in the map curve within that 15%. I think there are some lipids in the diet as contributing towards that 15% reduction. There's this talk of the 3-NOP kind of compound being added in boluses and things to animals to get more significant methane reduction. So those things I think are going to play an important role in the future. We just can't be sure exactly how big that reduction is going to be.
There's questions there in relation to the feasibility and importance of whole farm carbon budgeting or evaluation being carried out at farm level to try and support farmers in their decision making in relation to this. And the question is, how feasible is this approach and how practical is it to put it on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly feasible. Of course, if we had better handle on some of like if we had a more disaggregated inventory that could kind of recognize hedgerows and individual trees, for example, that might contribute better to that kind of approach. But there's also a question of, do we want to, maybe we don't want every farm to be carbon neutral, because maybe some farms are on more productive land that we should focus on producing more milk and more beef on that land and spare other areas for the offsetting activity. So I think it comes back to the question of scale. Do we want climate neutrality at a farm level, a catchment level, or regional or national level? And I think those are things that we need to think about carefully, because they affect the mechanisms, I guess, of how we implement this.
Just a question in relation to the possibility of us continuing in the longer term to sequester into I suppose our peatlands, but also into our general farmlands, and the amount of research that's needed in that space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very uncertain area. I mean, there's big uncertainty linked with organic soil emissions, with net sequestration into grassland and mineral soils. At the moment, we've got a large emission problem. We don't have a big sink. We've got an emission source in the land sector. So it could be, that could be reduced with better research, better understanding. We might not have as many emissions as we think, but equally it could be even bigger than we think. So I think the research itself, it's going to refine the estimates, but I think the ballpark of what we need to do is going to be the same. We know we need to re-wet, whether it's 10 tons or 20 tons of CO2 per hectare. We need to avoid those emissions. They're dead emissions, they're not productive. So we need to take similar actions irrespective of what some of that future research is going to show, I think.
And maybe a final question, there's what is the short-term implication for policies changing? And I suppose we're in the process of reviewing CAP to begin a new regime from 2023 on. What are the implications for that towards the long-term achievement of the kind of vision that you're putting out there?
Yeah, I think it's fundamental, because I think the support system to farmers shapes what farmers do. Farmers respond to the kind of policy and economic environment they're in. And I think that's a very powerful lever, because it's using public money to reward farmers for doing different things. So I think farmers need to be, the mechanisms need to be carefully thought through, so that the types of things farmers are rewarded for are actually the things that are going to deliver climate neutrality. And there's perhaps some care needed here about, perhaps it comes back to scale. There's a lot of talk about measuring everything at farm scale. We don't want to get too bogged down in too much bureaucracy and measurement and verification either. We kind of need to have some quite simple rules about which actions lead to which outcomes, and then to simply reward those actions without getting too bogged down in the finer detail, which is going to lead to a quagmire that doesn't benefit anybody.
I suppose a huge level of appreciation of the talk you've just given from the audience in terms of the challenging nature and the fact that it's shed a lot of light on a lot of complex issues. So I suppose that's a general comment from the audience.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'd like to second that. I think it's a really complicated area. So, David, I think you have successfully managed to break it down for us. So, I mean, from what I'm taking it from the message here is a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach is what's needed here, and that there's going to be significant change on the horizon. David, thank you so much for your time today and preparing for today as well. Just to remind everybody that today's webinar will be available on a podcast version as well. So wherever you tune into your podcast, you can download today's podcast or indeed any of the previous webinars. Pat, thanks very much for helping with the questions today, and thanks to Yvonne in the background for helping on the technical side, and of course to our series producer Andy Boland as well. Next week we'll be joined by Gavin Hunt from the Farm Zero project, and also Cian White from Trinity College Dublin, who's going to be talking about the Farm Zero C project. And so do tune in to that next Friday morning at 9:30. Thanks again, David, for joining us today, and also a reminder that today's presentation, the actual presentation and recording of the webinar, will be available on the Teagasc website. And thanks to everybody for really insightful questions. I think it's a demonstration of the huge knowledge that is out there amongst the farming sector and the awareness that's there of this really important issue. So we're delighted to keep covering this important topic, and do keep the questions coming. But thanks again for joining us today, and we'll talk to you next week.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.